SQL Managed Instance Pools are generally available. Learn all about the benefits of how you can save money and increase your isolation. This week on Data Exposed. Hi, I'm Anna Hoffman, and welcome to this episode of Data Exposed. Today, I'm joined by Georgie. Thanks so much for joining us today. Can you kick us off by telling us a little bit about what you do?
Hi, Anna. Great to be here. My name is Georgie, and I'm a product manager in Azure SQL Managed Instance team. We're a big Azure SQL family. And today, I'd like to talk a little bit about SQL Managed Instance Pools.
Awesome. Cool. This is something I'm really excited about. These have been around for a while. I think recently there's been some announcements that we're going to talk about, but let's get right into it, Georgia, and tell me a little bit like what are SQL MI instance pools and why should people care about them?
Yes, thank you. Well, SQL Managed Instance is Azure SQL service that is ideal for all customers that want to move their SQL Server workloads to the cloud. Now, SQL Managed Instance Pool presents a deployment option that enables provisioning a very small 2 vCore instances, which is great for cost-effective reasons, obviously, also for faster instance provisioning, and for centrally managed provisioning that I'm going to talk a little bit about today. Instance pools support not only 2 vCore instances, they support various sizes up to 80 vCores of SQL MI, so you can combine those instances in the pool. Now, what's really a difference from a single instance is beside the fact that it's a pool. Already with the provisioning, the customers see that with traditional SQL Managed Instance or singleton SQL Managed Instance, the provisioning experience is really one step. So immediately the customer gets provisioned compute infrastructure as well as SQL MI app. With instance pools, it's a two-step. First, the customers provision compute infrastructure, and then they provision managed instances as a separate step. Now, MI pools come with lots of flexibility. For example, you can create an instance pool. You could create then a new SQL MI into the pool. You can move a singleton external SQL MI into that pool. You can then decide, for example, to resize the pooled instance or to resize the instance pools altogether. You can then, of course, populate further instances into that pool or then decide to move out one of those instances out of the pool. You can delete pooled instances and also decide to resize or downsize the pool if you don't need such a capacity.
Nice. So you have a lot of flexibility. Yeah.
Exactly. Basically, you don't end up in a dead end.
Right.
Now, the question is when to use instance pools. Of course, with small SQL MIs, the cost-effective 2 vCore option really provides for a lot of consolidation opportunities. For example, already with SQL MI, some of those 4 vCore SQL MIs can probably run on a smaller 2 vCore instances, especially if those workloads are not mission critical. Also, and perhaps even more importantly, 2 vCore SQL MIs present a great target to migrate and modernize SQL VMs to the PaaS service such as SQL MI. Actually, in many purchasing scenarios due to licensing conditions, SQL MIs can be even lower cost than SQL VMs. And of course, when migrating SQL Server from on-premises, especially when you have, for example, data exit, this granularity, 2 vCore granularity that SQL MI now provides gives much more options when you're trying to map your small SQL Server workloads to small SQL MIs.
Awesome. Makes sense. One question for you on cost optimization. Is the cost different or is the big difference that you can just kind of deploy less and get more? Is it just a matter of utilizing those resources or are there actual cost differences?
It's the second. So the business model for SQL MI is per vCore. That doesn't change. The vCore price stays the same. It's just the fact that now you don't need to provision 4 vCores. If you don't need them, you provision, for example, 2 vCores. So it's basically 50% of the price.
Nice.
Thank you. So the second use case is about centralized provisioning. So especially with big corporations and big customers, centralized platforms teams are normally the ones who manage the procurement, also SQL Server procurement, that set up the environment, networking, security, roles, etc., and generally make sure that the compliance is ensured. In such a cases, the instance pools are great because you can do all that, manage procurement, set up the environment, networking, security, etc. And then when app teams require ad hoc SQL servers, they can get that and in a fast and compliant manner. And the third use case is about SaaS ISVs. So many software vendors, they provision or they have such a software architecture that as a database they use SQL Server, and for many of them they don't really need a big SQL servers. So these 2 vCore instances are also good. And why is the instance paradigm here important? Because in many of those solutions, the customers are using actually cross database queries and things like SQL agent, and that's why managed instance due to its high SQL surface area compatibility to SQL Server, the great choice. Now I will describe an example that you can do 2 things at once, and that's a situation where you have, for example, 3 4 vCore SQL MIs like today. So you can at the same time both optimize costs and increase isolation. So first we can take those 2 4 vCore instances and move them into a pool and resize. So basically saving 50% of the cost. And the third one, we can assume that it has 10 databases. We can split those 10 databases. So instead of them being in the same instance on 4 vCores, we can move them into the pool onto the small 2 vCore instances and increase effectively isolation while on the total decreasing the costs. Now, how do you do that in Azure? In PowerShell, moving an instance into a pool, it's a single line command where you specify in instance pool and the instance size. And then you can see in the Azure portal that those 2 instances are in the pool. We can then continue in the portal to create a third managed instance in that pool. The experience is the same like we have today for singleton managed instances. Of course, you enter instance name, and then very important, you switch the button that says belongs to an instance pool. You can choose existing pool, and further when you configure an instance, you will see that option 2 vCore compute option that is exclusive property of pooled instances. For the rest, it's pretty much the same. The only thing we need to do now to complete this example is to create to select an admin. After we did that, we can just leave all defaults and create that instance. The pooled managed instance is faster. The provisioning time is faster than for a singleton managed instance. So in up to 10 minutes, the instance will be provisioned. If we go now to the resource and select on the instance pool property, we'll see that our instance pool now has the third instance provision. We'll now just repeat the same process for the fourth instance, and we'll end up with a pool that has 4 2 vCore instances. Now for the final phase of our example, we want to move those 10 databases and redistribute across 2 instances. We'll use database move feature, select 5 databases from the sort database, and select the target instance that we just made in the pool. We'll kick off the move. It's a 2-step process. In the first step, there is a data seeding. Once this is completing, we'll select again those 10 databases that are now ready for move completion. And once we complete, we'll see that those 5 databases will become gray. That means they're no longer in the source instance. If we switch now to the managed instance that in a pool, that is a target database, a target instance for those databases, we'll see those 5 databases. And we'll repeat the same process for the remaining 5 databases from the source instance, move them in the target instance, and we completed our example. So I'll just recap what we quickly saw through the portal. Before we had 3 instances with 12 vCores in total, and afterwards we had 4 instances with 8 vCore in total. So we achieved both cost optimization as well as increased isolation in this case.
Nice. That's awesome. This is a great scenario, and it's great to see how easy it is and how seamless you guys have kind of made this process of optimizing and increasing network isolation. So there's a couple different use cases you might have here. One question for you is like some people may be familiar with elastic pools in Azure SQL database. Similar kind of concepts, I think, where you can, kind of provision a pool and then resource share, cost optimize. Similarly, like what's your advice for people when they're thinking about, hey, is an instance pool the right thing for me or an elastic pool with Azure SQL DB?
Yeah, thank you. That's an important question. Elastic pools in SQL database world are great when you want to use a SQL database or single database as a paradigm, as an architectural paradigm, and when you want to combine them and sort of time multiplex them, so what they can share the same resources, because the isolation level is fairly low when it comes to the compute, but on the other side, it's a great cost-wise. So if you can, if your workloads have such a scenario, this is a fantastic way to optimize cost. On the instance pool side, there is isolation is pretty high, so there is no sharing of the same compute between instances. So it's a more for the scenarios when you need a managed instance paradigm to the SQL Server instance paradigm, and when you want to save the cost, so you say, okay, this is the smallest instance I can provision, it's 2 core.
Awesome. Yeah, that totally makes sense. And also from the like you mentioned a scenario earlier around migrating. And for many reasons, SQL managed instance may be easier to migrate. SQL agent was one thing you mentioned, or cross DB querying. So maybe you landing in SQL MI, and that makes a lot of sense. Any final things? I think you mentioned this was generally available, or is it generally available? And any tips for folks who are just getting started?
Yeah, it is generally available. We're very happy about it since November 24. So if you want to learn more, I provided here two links. One is for SQL MI pools, and the other is for the other feature that I showcase in this example. That is a great match to the instance pool when you're trying to consolidate and redistribute. And this is a DB copy of.
Awesome. Well, great. Thanks so much, Georgia, for coming on the show. I learned a lot about instance pools, and I'm sure our viewers did as well. Viewers, if you like this episode, go ahead, give it a like, leave us a comment, let us know what you plan to do or what you're already doing with managed instance pools, which are generally available. We'll put those links in the description for you to go learn more, and we hope to see you next time on Data Exposed.